Cam, let's dive right in. Let's start right in the difficult one. This is an argument we hear often on the streets when people come to us and use their justification. They often come to some sort of argument like this one, some sort of along these lines. Abortion is justified when a mother is too young. Now, as we often do, Cam, we often like to start with what they're getting at. So maybe help us out a little bit. When you hear something like this from someone on the streets, what are they getting at? What are you hearing? What is it that you try to respond to?
Yeah, for sure. This is something that I've heard time and time again, not only on street corners and doorsteps, but I would argue even more often at senior high schools. Peter, you and I are often at senior high schools where not only are our students coming to their initial conclusion on the abortion issue, they're making up their minds on what they believe about abortion. It's being taught in the schools and all that kind of thing. But also, this is where people are becoming pregnant as well. It's not just college kids that are becoming pregnant. High school students become pregnant as well. And one thing that I think is important to recognize is that there's two kind of components that a lot of these people are getting at, whether they're in high school themselves or whether they're thinking about high school students. Yes, on the one hand, there are some people who are thinking about this with regards to the welfare of that newborn child. They're saying, oh my goodness, think about that newborn child and think about how difficult their life is going to be if their mother is in high school. Think about the lack of support, the lack of maturity that their parent is going to have. This is going to be really tough on that baby. And there is a sizable demographic that do have that child as their primary concern of like, this kid's quality of life is going to be really low. But Peter, from my experience, the majority of the people who talk to me about the age of the mother are actually more concerned about the life of the actual mother sort of thing, not the child that's being born, not their quality of life, but rather the quality of life of the mom and potentially the dad as well, with this notion that these kids just made a mistake. You're asking them to throw their entire life away, and they're going to be pregnant. They're not going to be able to pursue their post-secondary education. They're not going to be able to pursue careers. They're going to be a single mom or a single dad. They're not going to have a healthy relationship and marriage, and they're not going to be able to have a good life. You're really willing to tank the rest of their life because of one simple tiny mistake that they made. I think often this might be kind of funny for some people. Some people this might not resonate at all. There's a classic movie from the 90s that I'm not a big fan of called Mean Girls. And there's this PE teacher who's doing their sex ed that says, like, if you have sex, you will get pregnant and you will die. This idea that like your life is over. And there's a lot of people who think that it's a condemnation. Like this is a civil judgment on these moms, these teenage moms saying like, we are going to ruin your life. Absolutely. You don't deserve a good life if you make one tiny mistake in high school. And I think that that's what a lot of people are getting at when they bring up this mother's too young kind of notion, that in part of their mind, they're thinking about the quality of life of the child, but largely the majority of their focus is on the quality of life of the mother and or father who are involved in that, and how this is going to derail so many of their plans that they've laid out but in front of them.
Yeah, that's right, and that's key. And I often hear people say something along the lines of like, you honestly want a child to have another child, to give birth to another child. They're still a child. They shouldn't be able to do that for the reasons that you mentioned, Cam. And now I often think, when we're doing these episodes about one of the things you've taught me, and that's the tendency that we have. I certainly have this from time to time, to want to either resolve the problem or to refute it. Now, we can resolve the problem in a sense with true facts. We can refute a problem with true facts. But in a conversation, when we're trying to change someone's mind on abortion, these are not going to be the most effective. And so, one of the ways we could refute this perhaps would be to share some stats. A 2015 study indicates that people under 17 years old account for approximately 2.2% of all abortions. So we could say it's like so minimal, it's so small, this hardly happens at all. So how can this be your justification? We can also resolve it by saying that there are many schools and other support programs that are rapidly advancing in their ability to support mothers and to make teenage pregnancy much more manageable. And if you would just connect to some of these programs, then your life would be better and you'd be able to work through this. We're trying to resolve the issue for them in the conversation. But a key thing to remember, Cam, is that these things don't get to the heart of the abortion conversation. And at the end of the day, they're not going to change someone's mind on abortion, because you're not actually talking about whether abortion is right or wrong. And the heart of the question, heart of the issue, which is who are preborn children. But you're dealing with some of the issues on the side. Are they important things to talk about from time to time? Sure, they absolutely could be. But in our conversations to change people's minds, we need to remember not to refute the claim that they're making, and not to resolve the claim that they're making with some of our own suggestions and recommendations, but to use some of the tools that we've presented in the past, finding common ground, using analogies, and asking questions, and doing that strategically so that we can get those people to think more deeply about the issue at hand, about abortion, as not just abortion, by itself, but even abortion in light of some of these difficult circumstances, including this one where we're talking about a young person being pregnant with a young child. So, Cam, how would you start to respond to someone on the streets who brings something like this up? Where would you start? How would you walk through the conversation?
So one last thing I'll mention before I dive into what I would do, one thing that you shouldn't do, that I think that this is one of the most scarring and problematic things that you can do. It's not refuting or even resolving. The number of people that I've heard callously kind of condemn this as a life lesson opportunity. Well, she should have just kept her legs closed. I
Right.
remember I was at a high school choice train and I had a pro-lifer come by. He was just walking through the street. He met us. We had a short conversation. And one of the girls brought this up and he said, well, you should have just kept your legs closed. And I almost punched him in the nose. Like I straight up said to that girl, this guy's not with us. He has no idea what he's talking about. Don't listen to a word he says. Like I was so mad that he would say that, because the idea of like, oh, well, you have to deal with the consequences of your actions. Okay, well, that is a thing. But to treat this as a life lesson is not going to help the situation. This isn't like, okay, you cheated on a test, you go to detention, you have to rewrite the test kind of thing. This isn't like a, you know what, this is a little slap on the wrist kind of thing. For this girl, she's looking at, if we're going to consider this as a consequence or a punishment, does the next, however, like 80 years of my life, is that kind of punishment, if we're going to view it as a punishment, warrant the crime of premarital sex? I think that's a really bad route to go. So please don't ever, ever, ever say that. What we should say, common ground analogy question, common ground. I mean, you and I can agree that it can be incredibly difficult as a young woman, as a girl in high school, to be pregnant. Right? There's lacking in support and understanding and acceptance, the ostracization, the challenges, the social challenges, the emotional challenges, the physical challenges of being pregnant in high school are incredible, right? We have to recognize that. We have to empathize with that. That said, we can build into our analogy by saying, imagine that somebody in grade 10 became pregnant, and she happened to be at one of these really progressive high schools where they had a daycare right there in the school. They had support available. They had counselors that could help out. They had at distance learning during the last couple months of pregnancy when she may not be able to make it into class. She's at one of these progressive schools. We got a couple of them here in Calgary. I'm sure they've got a bunch of them in Toronto. Imagine she says, you know what, we can do this. My boyfriend is here. My parents are supportive. And she goes ahead and she has the baby. She's got that support. The school's helping out. It's fantastic. But when she's in grade 11, that kid is 1 year old. Her parents, their jobs transfer them to a new city. And no longer are they living in Toronto. They're living in like some really cool, don't get me wrong, but like some random place like Hornpain, Ontario, some place that's like super out in the middle of nowhere. And the high school, it's a great high school. The teachers are cool. The kids are nice, all that kind of thing. But they moved there and her boyfriend doesn't move. And maybe that high school isn't equipped to have at-distance learning or in-school daycare. Maybe her parents aren't able to help out as much because they are settling into their own jobs and the transfer is not super smooth. Would we ever suggest that she can kill her 1-year-old child because being in grade 11 is far too young to have a 1-year-old child without any external support? Pivot to the question that brings us back to the humanity of the preborn. If we're not willing to kill a 1-year-old when their mom is too young to support her, why are we willing to kill a preborn child when her mom is supposedly too young to support her? Brings it back to the humanity of the preborn, brings in what I think is a very relevant, very realistic, and very relatable kind of circumstance for people, analogy for people. That's how I would do it, Peter. Does that make sense to you?
It does, yeah, and one of the things, that we like to highlight in these types of conversations is that we are dealing with the truth of what abortion is, but we're also doing so gently. We're doing so, taking into consideration the circumstances that the person is in, and really trying to help them as well, right? Showing that compassion, showing that empathy for them in that situation, while at the same time recognizing that these preborn children are in fact human beings and they are in fact alive today. And so that's good. Yeah, Cam, thank you so much for that. That's what it looks like to find common ground, to use analogies, and to ask questions. Those analogies are key in terms of what we call trotting out the toddler. So using a toddler in the same situation and asking whether we should be allowed to end the life of that child, and if we shouldn't, why should we be allowed to end the life of the very same child for the very same reason just a few months before when that child is in the womb.
Subscribe to the Pro Life Guys podcast YouTube channel for more clips like this, and for full episodes of the Pro Life Guys podcast, find us on all of your favorite podcast catchers.